Hello, everyone, and so sorry for the late start, but we're still letting folks in. As you know, this is being recorded, so you can check back if you need to leave. So again, welcome to the Center for Refugee and Immigrant Success at Levin State University. Today, we have Deirdre Mageean, Professor of Urban Studies in the Levin College of Urban Affairs, in our presentation for environmental refugees. A brief introduction. This is presented by the CRIS Center, and the co-directors are myself and Grace Huang. And I wanted to go over the mission and vision real quick. And Yochum will do the introduction of Deirdre. Deirdre will do the presentation. We'll have a Q&A time, as well as some closing remarks by my co-director, Grace Huang. So I know we've said this before in some of our other recordings, but we have new people every time. So I just want to tell you a little bit about how this all got started. In 2016, a research team in the management department, Ben Barron, Soren Valchea, Tracy Porter, and myself embarked upon a publication for a special issue on survival expectations and employment for refugees. That was our publication. We finally had that published in 2018, and around that same time, we started the center. In 2021 now, we have nearly 30 faculty, students, and alumni, and we focus on volunteer efforts, scholarship, and teaching. So some of our faculty have students doing practicums, volunteering with refugees. Many of us are also volunteering on our own time. And then, of course, all of this leads to best practices and scholarship. So the vision is to be the nexus of collaborative and interdisciplinary production of thought and the application of the social science and humanities on a research-based perspective, and promote the economic flourishing of refugees and immigrants in Northeast Ohio and beyond. So the team is amazing. I won't go through every single one of them, but our profiles are on our website, the CRIS website, and we're updating that all the time with new faculty who are trying to contribute. And as you can see, we have a tremendous array of wraparound thought leadership as well as services for the refugee community. If you could, please tell us a little bit about yourself in the introductions, introduce yourself in the chat, a little bit about your name, organization, and why you're interested in this topic. We will continue to add you to our email lists for future events. And now I will have Yochum, a research assistant in the Center for Economic Development, as well as a student in the Maxine Goodman Levin College of Urban Affairs, introduce Deirdre.
Alrighty, hello. It's great to be speaking in front of this group yet again. As mentioned, my name is Yochum. I've been doing research with the university for about a year now. It was actually about 8 months ago. I did a presentation alongside Dr. Brian Mickelbank relating to historical immigration settlements within Cleveland. So I have a bit of research knowledge of this area, and I would definitely consider it one of my interests at this point. As mentioned, I do work for the Center for Economic Development, so I am a staff member at the university, and I'm pursuing my Master's of Urban Studies. Back in my undergrad here, I did environmental studies as well. To talk a bit about our presenter today, Dr. Deirdre Mageean is a professor of urban studies at the Levin College of Urban Affairs. She is a demographer by trade, a term that we don't often hear used as much in academia. That really means, demography is the study of statistics that kind of illustrate the changing structures of population. So births, deaths, immigration, emigration, and so on. So for a lot of us being social scientists, we kind of operate under the framework of demography and sociology, and what bounds do our populations exist in and what are they made of inside of that. Previous to holding this position as professor, she was I'm reading from my notes here because there's quite a bit. If you ask her personally, she'll say she's never been able to hold down a good job. She's the Dean of Graduate School and Associate Vice President of Research at the University of Maine, the Vice Chancellor for Research and Graduate Studies at East Carolina University, and the Provost and Senior Vice President of Academic Affairs at Cleveland State. Speaking a bit personally here, Dr. Mageean and I, I had 2 classes with her during my undergrad, one on population dynamics and another on research methods. So she and I have had the relationship for a few years now. She's definitely inspired a good host of my passions in research, and I'm happy to call her not only a colleague, but a friend. Some of her research specialties, which are very, very varied, I should say, include food insecurity, demography of higher education and the workforce, kind of how immigrants can revitalize the Rust Belt region. So there's quite a bit both locally and abroad to look at. And she herself is an immigrant. So with all of that being said, I would like to turn it over to her.
Okay, thank you, Jack. I was nothing bad there. I thought that he was going to exact some revenge for all the, the comments I wrote on his papers. But thank you. Well, it is truly fortuitous to be able to present this topic today. Just this morning, the White House released a report on climate, and it's actually a compendium of 4 reports, and one of them is on climate change and migration. 37-page report, so needless to say, I haven't had a chance to look at it other than the page intro, but it looks fascinating, and so we are very much on topic here. So as Jack said, I was a migrant myself, I was actually trained in historical demography, so we looked a lot at population changes with the effects of famine, war, seasonality of diseases. I was probably one of the few people that was really on top of what was going on with the pandemic. But of course, if you're Irish and you study population, the famine is right up there in all our thoughts. And my own PhD was on out-migration from Ireland to the East Coast, specifically Philadelphia, New Orleans, and the Canadian Maritimes over the course of a whole century, with the famine as a kind of watershed in all of that. And one of the things, of course, the Great Famine, as it's called, or in Irish, and Gortamora, the Great Hunger, was just the huge effects it had on population. 1 million, at least 1 million, maybe some people say 1 to 1.5 million, from starvation, typhus, and cholera that come, of course, when a malnourished population, opportunistic diseases come in. And it actually is proportionately the largest famine since modern, some kind of records began. So a population that was in 1841 over 8 million, today is still well short of that. The Irish Republic just crossed 5 million, and North of Ireland is about 1.5. So we're still 1.5 million people short from 1851. And it put into motion, of course, a huge out-migration. And the cause, the villain of the piece, of course, apart from the politics and the land tenure, was this potato blight. So after a series of very cold, wet summers, 3-4 years of sequence, blight as often happens affected. And of course, this was the subsistence crop of the Irish. And so when that failed, and there were no seed potatoes or anything, devastating hunger. And it affected not only Ireland, by the way, but Germany and the Netherlands. So this was not, but of course, nowhere but in Ireland was there such dependence on it. And it led to this huge out-migration. So it got me thinking, and at the same time I was working on sea level rise and climate change issues in Maine. I was working with the EPA and the State Planning Office. I thought, this is interesting. We've seen in history this kind of thing. I wonder, how are there any lessons from the past? So if we move on to the next one, of course, what we'll see is these are the monuments that you see in Ireland, the starving people and the boats. Go ahead, next. So historically, of course, there's lots of evidence. This picture is from the Dust Bowl. I've just finished reading a great novel by Kristen Hanna's book called The Four Winds, which is set in the Dust Bowl. Highly commend that to anybody. But we know that we've got our own history. We have had the Dust Bowl, which caused huge out-migration, not just of Okies, but people from Texas, Oklahoma, Arkansas, all over to California in search of job after their drought. Years of drought had killed their land, and that the winds just lifted the topsoil, and it took huge efforts to get those lands back into cultivation. So in 1996, get this, yes, in 1996, I organized a panel at the Population Association of America called Migratory Responses to Climate Change, Lessons from the Past. So boy, was I ahead of my time in many ways. And now, of course, with climate change accelerating, so dramatically in different parts of the world, it's really at the forefront of policymakers and others' views. So climate change definitely is a defining crisis of our time, as it says here, and the number of people it displaces. Now, demographers are pretty into this because, you know, fundamentally we are, since old Malthus, we are interested in the relationship between people, population, resources, and environment. So we're kind of naturally drawn to this kind of thing. But when we think of it, climate change and disaster displacement really needs multiple disciplines coming together, as does climate change as a whole. I often joked as provost that, you know, universities had departments and society had problems. And this is clearly an area where we need to be working together. And there's not enough of it yet, but as I'll point out to you, I think we need to. So one of the things that happens when we have climate change and displacement of people, sometimes devastating, whether it's drought, which we're seeing now in lots of places like sub-Saharan Africa and places in Africa, whether it's flooding, whether it's wildfires in California and hurricanes in Houston, people are displaced temporarily or sometimes permanently. And often it happens too in places that are politically unstable or where there's a lot of conflict and wars. So we know roughly what refugees are, but we also have this other term, IDPs, internally displaced people. And actually refugees represent only about a third of the world's displaced population. Internally displaced people are huge. So 40 million just in 2007. And that means they are displaced within their country. They didn't actually cross an international boundary. We're very focused in the United States on that southern border and people coming across. But actually, a lot of this we'll see relates not just to people crossing national boundaries, but who are moving within their countries, sort of internal refugees, so to speak. Next. So the problem with our climate refugees or environmental refugees that actually we don't have an official definition. We all love definitions, legal and otherwise. And if you look at the categories under which people, for instance, can be admitted to the United States, there's all these different categories and different visas associated with them, all determined by Congress, except for two, refugees and asylees. And the president, of course, has, that he is the one that's, or she.
Hi there. Sorry, may I have a quarter pounder meal with no ketchup and a Coke, please?
Trying to disregard that. The term environmental refugees doesn't have an official recognition. In fact, none of the international agencies that says it works here, not the United Nations Commission on Refugees or any of the aid agencies. It's not actually says here codified in any national or international law. And that creates a problem because there's a problem with the term and it's controversial. There's no doubt about that. Next, please. So what are they? Well, we define a refugee, as most of you who are interested in this subject, as someone who's crossed an international border because they fear for their lives or well-being because of persecution. It could be race, as we saw in ethnic cleansing around the world. It could be religion, it could be nationality, membership of a particular social group, or political opinion. And that goes all the way back to 1951. Or it could be people fleeing events that are seriously disturbing public order. That's more tricky, and we're seeing a lot of that now with people from Haiti. Climate change, on the other hand, affects people in their own countries and usually creates, as I say, this internal displacement before sometimes it reaches a level where they go right across borders. But we've got really no way of identifying them and classifying them except in their own declaration. But there is a thing called In Harm's Way with the United Nations High Commission said, we look at claims, but it's not endorsed by them. So they call them persons displaced in the context of disasters and climate change. I guess 2 words was too much, too brief for them. Next. So as we know, as I said, the president is the person who determines the number of refugees. And certainly when it does bounce around from year to year and administration to administration, it really plummeted in the previous administration in general. Okay, so in general, United States, but of course that didn't mean that there weren't refugees out there. That was simply the ones that we were not admitting. Although the United States still remains one of the biggest destination for refugees, although proportionately a few other countries do more. Next. And so question is, if we've got this term and nobody's truly recognized it, how do we distinguish between these various types of people? So clearly there are refugee-like situations, as we called, low level of control of your whole process. You're very vulnerable and you're not in control of this. So sometimes you are displaced. It can be war, it can be persecution, it can be failures of crops, whatever. Environmentally driven, it's compelled, but it still is voluntary. It's people saying, I see what's coming down the road. The harvest has failed for 2 years. Doesn't look like we're going to get any crops this year. We're going to go. And it got a little bit of control of where they can go. So it's not, total calamity pushing you right out. But there's less control than sort of ordinary migrants, like myself, we decided it was a voluntary situation. And then we've got migrants like me and others who have control over the process. We're not really vulnerable. I told people I fled Mrs. Thatcher, but that's it's not, one wasn't allowed. So we're moving in response to deteriorating conditions. Actually, in our case, it was the deteriorating conditions of British universities. So that's migration. So we go from voluntary to all the way down to people who are displaced and who have little control. And ordinarily, when you see whole families going, that's when you see there's some really compelling, huge force. Next. So what we've seen over time, and this is from the United Nations High Commission, you see, this is again running from 2000 almost up to today, the big line, these are our internally displaced people. These are the people who are the largest number of people who've had to leave their homes. And it's bigger, as you can see, than refugees, the officially designated refugees. But inside those IDPs and others are, of course, a lot of these climate propelled people. And then we have stateless people, we have the asylum seekers and others. So you can really see how over time, this number of IDPs and refugees have both gone up, especially the IDPs. Next. I'll leave this with you because I take up too much time looking at it, but this is from an article that actually the UK government has produced on migration and global environmental change. So they did this in 2011. And today the White House came out and they will actually show some of the influences that they've identified of environmental change on drivers and what forced people to go. Next. Because what we can say is climate's rarely the main cause, although it's becoming more and more so, but it works together with other things like political instability and violence. And we'll see that particularly in Central and South America. So I teach a course from time to time on Asian and African megacities, and I always show students where these big cities are and where there's a lot of high growth. And you could say, well, why cities? That's not normally where we think of drought and famine, etc. But if we look at where they are, you will see a lot of them are along the coast. A lot of them are along the coast, which leads to a certain vulnerability, as we will see with things like rising sea level. Next. And these are our megacities, and the ones with the diamond shapes are what we call our coastal megacities. We've identified some down below, and they're very, very vulnerable to various kinds of weather-related hazards and subsidence, meaning the land is actually sinking or falling into the ocean. And they're color-coded there by the various types. But you can see if we just look at Asia, everywhere from Karachi over, and even Istanbul and Cairo, they're very much vulnerable to things like rising sea level, as indeed is New York. Other places like Mexico City or inland are very prone to other things. But interestingly, we expect the urban areas to become areas that migrants will flee to, and sometimes they may be running into the mouth of the dragon, so to speak. Next. So we like to think in some ways, internal displaced people and climate refugees exist in other countries. But as New York has experienced in the last 5-10 years, it is extremely vulnerable to sea level rise. I'm going to show you 2 maps here which indicate social vulnerability, population density, and property values, and what things might look like under the scenarios that the IDHP has posted. And we'll see that a lot of New York is extremely vulnerable. And this is an area of high population density, but also of very, very expensive property. Next. On the other hand, we have Florida, which is somewhere we'd be more typically thinking about. And you can see how much of Florida is vulnerable here. Again, a lot of expensive property, huge tourist destination, and increasingly a very populous state. And it is extraordinarily vulnerable to surging seas, as are many of our cities just here in the United States, Boston, Norfolk, quite a lot of them. And they are increasingly, Miami floods virtually every day. It's just a daily occurrence now. But now a lot of the cities, New York is way ahead in terms of its planning, but all the other cities having experienced storms that they experience are really sitting up and trying to come up with what we would call plans for both mitigation, which is trying to stop it getting any worse, and adaptations like, well, how do we live and how do we deal with this? And next. So we have resources, we have planners, we have all the things that we talk about in urban studies to deal with our cities, but many cities are not in such a fortunate position. And yet, as we will see from this map, the climate related challenges, to put it mildly, but dangers in its more realistic form, is going to hit large swaths of the world. And sometimes those are rising sea levels, but also, as you can see from the sort of yellowy orange ones, these are areas that are exposed to desertification and drought. And we are seeing increased drought and increased desertification. We have this thing called the Sahel belt in Africa. And we always talk about sub-Saharan Africa and North Africa, at least those of us who are demographers. Sub-Saharan Africa being the part which has been less well off and has also been hit by a lot of things like Ebola and AIDS, devastating their populations. But as you can see, starting in Spain and going right across over into Turkey and moving up through some of the former Soviet republics and into Central Asia, there's incredible drought there, as there is in Asia. The purplish areas are more looking at sea level rise, and we have some extraordinary vulnerabilities in the island communities, everything from small ones like the Maldives, all the way up through Indonesia, Malaysia, anything in the Pacific, and Central and South America, but also some of our own coasts, as you can see on the East Coast. So these are all climate vulnerable parts of the world. And we're seeing more floods, more drought, and of course, the rising sea levels can exacerbate the already vulnerability of people living in low-lying areas. Next. Oh, there we go. So one of the areas I've had a special look at, because I visited the country, is what's going on in Central America. And we're seeing a lot more of people from Central America turning up on the border on the south. It used to be just Mexico. And interestingly, there was a seminal paper written in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences way back in 2010 by a combination of disciplines, people who were labor economists and agronomists, and it was called Linkages Among Climate Change, Crop Yields, and Mexico-US Cross-Border Migration. And the econometricians on the team actually started modeling what each degree rise in temperature would mean in terms of failure of crops, people being displaced, and trying to cross over into the United States. And, you know, depending on the scenarios, and of course, they've been changed a good bit since 2010, for the worse, I'm afraid. They said if you hold all other levels constant, they reckoned that by the year 2080, climate change could induce 1.4 to 6.7 million Mexicans to emigrate because of declines in agricultural productivity related to heat and to drought. And they actually extrapolated, you know, for each degree, how many people we would see. But now we realize that the impacts are affecting not just Mexico, but Central and actually further into South America. And what ordinarily happens with migrants, as we know, is that people tend not to just go in one movement. They tend to go in stages. Sometimes we call it chain or step migration. And they will move, first of all, to cities and then to further on. And we are seeing, of course, now these huge numbers of people coming, not just from Mexico. In fact, Mexico is becoming like a receiving point for people whose ultimate destination is to get into the United States. So I have been to El Salvador twice. is a country I'm pretty familiar with. If we can move on, Jack, to the next slide. And it's a perfect example of what I mentioned earlier, and the climate is rarely the main cause, but when it comes together with other forces, we see a big uptick in migration. So in Central America, Guatemala and El Salvador in particular, what you're seeing is a true confluence of violence, political instability, and climate change. The political instability has plagued them for decades. I'm not going to go into all their histories, but it is quite extraordinary. Next. And I will refer you to this magazine article, which is phenomenal. I don't think we got the time, Jack, to just go into it, but if I do, can you click on that just very quickly? Just give people a taste and then we'll exit out of it. Oh, I may have banjaxed the whole thing. It's a little video, doesn't it? It doesn't look like it's coming up, does it? Well, never mind. We can skip on, Jack. But I would refer you to it. It appeared both in the they had a magazine part of the Sunday, the weekend magazine, but there's a little video that shows all that. So I seem to have lost the slides, Jack.
Yeah, so what happened was the video is going in my background, so I apologize. Let me try and shut that off.
Vicky can tell you all about it then.
I could translate as it.
Just do the voiceovers. It's okay, I can fill in all the details, no problem. We can get back to the slides.
Yes, thank you. Is that good?
Well, it says you've started it. Okay, so we'll just move on. We won't, but highly recommended you look at that. It was some phenomenal, it's so good that we have papers that still have good investigative journalists. And this is a classic example. So El Salvador, this is, it's a volcanic area, as is Guatemala. I've been right up on the Guatemalan border as well. This is typical of the red volcanic soil. They have active volcanoes in both countries. So that's that. And I took these photographs when I was up in the village of Chilchupan, which is right up in the mountains. Next. And these are some of the people that I visited. And as you can see, there's malnutrition and the circumstances under which people live. This little girl was part of a much larger family we met. You can see from the beginnings of her stomach being distended that she is suffering from malnutrition. And she and some of the other children we noticed like bone, maybe rickets or things like that were occurring. Next. And this is typical dwelling. It's essentially just corrugated. Whoever does corrugated metal cells, they must be making a fortune in El Salvador. Just branches, corrugated iron, and mud and straw filling in. And that's what the houses look like. And you understand those would be very vulnerable to any strong weather occurring. And you can see this red dusty soil that is there. Next. Actually, I think we've missed some. Can you go back? There should be something on El Salvador, on the a little bit on the history and the family. We're missing slides. No, we're missing slides. Uh-oh.
Sorry, I don't know. This is what I'm seeing.
Well, let me tell you what I can tell you about El Salvador. We can skip over that for a moment. It is extraordinarily poor. One of the highest, probably not like Haiti. So can we just go back to the backdrop of El Salvador, Jack? In the history of this place, it was and still is controlled by about 14 families. They're called the Catorce, and they are the affluent. And a lot of their control is agriculture. So they control the really, really good land. And they work in conjunction with fruit companies here, like Dole, bananas, or whatever. I mean, they are truly what gave rise to the term a banana republic. And those firms, of course, have very strong political influence and have had, as still do the 14 families there, with what goes on with politics. It's had a very violent past. Some of you remember it assassinated Archbishop Romero, the Catholic priests, the Jesuits who were talking about liberation theology. They were all assassinated, and so it was run by a military junta, which was in league. By the way, we trained their soldiers in Georgia, Fort Benning, I think we trained them there. But anyway, so the poor people were forced out onto the marginal land. And that is a classic story throughout the world. The poor inhabit the marginal land because either nobody cares about it or it's not worth anything, so they can go there. But marginal land, by its definition, is a very fragile ecosystem and prone to, it's very vulnerable, and put it that way. And so if you look, for instance, in Bangladesh, which is such a huge delta, the poor there. In our own country, poor are living in flood zones, along riverbanks, in areas that are prone to drought. So this is not just a developing world problem. We have this in our own. But the poor in El Salvador are up in the hills, because the Catorce still and the agribusiness control what's there, and they eke out a living as they can with maybe small crops, corn, coffee, whatever. And now what's happening on top of this huge poverty, they are first of all trying to move into places like San Salvador. So there's a backdrop of war, violence, and even hurricanes and poverty, which has led 1 in 6 El Salvadoran citizens to flee to the US over the course of the last few decades. And more are also trying to move into San Salvador, where of course they run into the whole issue of the gangs. MS-13, I think, MS-13, am I getting this right? The gangs are controlled. San Salvador is at various times the murder capital of the world. I've been there several times. Interestingly, they ignore we Americans and visitors. It's their own people that they're persecuting and murdering. So it's really it's a really great example of where things, a confluence of forces. And now what's really the straw that's breaking the camel's back completely is drought. Successive years of drought, which has led to the failure of the coffee crop, which has led to failure of the corn that they grow for their own subsistence. And so it is driving more people out. I mean, if you're lucky and some of the areas where places like my church and the Archdiocese of Cleveland are working, we're putting in water pipes, all kinds of things to help them, but not everybody is that fortunate. So in 2019, 90,000 El Salvadorans were apprehended at the US border alone. And under the kind of scenarios and scientific forecasts we now have for climate change, El Salvador just gets hotter and drier, as will Guatemala and all of those areas. So, this is not going to go away. And the interesting thing is, when you look at El Salvador too, it's a country which, along with some other countries, survives on the remittances that come from those migrants who are already in the United States. It constitutes somewhere between 17 and 20% of their total national budget, their GDP. And of course, we had threats to shut the border down and block remittances. If they blocked the remittances, it would only exacerbate the forces of poverty that will be driving people out. So this is a country, El Salvador and Guatemala are perfect examples of where climate was not the main cause, but when it comes together in this confluence with violence, with poverty, it's really just the perfect storm which pushes people out. How are we doing on time, Jack?
We have about 7 more minutes.
Okay, so clearly this one is on our back door, and it's a scenario that's been played out in other places. We've seen the people desperately trying to cross the Mediterranean. We've seen people now, one of my favorite charities is Save Children. And just yesterday in the little newsletter was included how climate crisis affects children. And its particular focus is on Somalia, which of course has had war and things there. But there's no food. There's been drought, successive years of drought. 2021, they're facing another drought this year. And there's support having to be given to about 1/3 of the population, about 6 million people, and the vulnerable women, children, young families. There's no jobs, there's no food, and it's not even what money they have is not enough to buy food or to get access to water. So this scenario is playing out and will increasingly play out in different parts of the world. There's whole parts of Asia that are extremely vulnerable to this as well. But sometimes we don't like to admit what's on our own doorstep. And I showed you some maps of sea level rise, but it's of course not the only threat that America is vulnerable to. So climate migrants, not a legal term as we saw, but we have an understanding of what they are. People who are displaced by the effects of climate change, often in conjunction with other things. And we have climate migrants when New Orleans was devastated by the floods. A lot of those people moved and never came back. They were displaced and they fled not just New Orleans, but in large measure Louisiana. I had a colleague who was doing a longitudinal public health study there, and he lost about half his patients. Research was severely curtailed because he had no idea where they went. We saw them in the Superdome. We saw the terrible pictures. Some of them heard somebody could go places, but if you have no money and no transportation, what do you do? But eventually a lot of these people just left. And of course, we do have buyouts for flood homes with people evacuating, families moving en masse. Houston, which has experienced 500-year storm all in 1 year. And my brother lives in Houston, and I know even how some of the affluent neighborhoods were affected. People have left there and maybe never coming back. We reckon that about 16.1 million people globally were displaced because of weather-related disasters. And about 1.2 of those were in the United States. And now we're beginning to pay attention. Journalists, policymakers, and very importantly, the insurance companies who are now refusing to insure. We have this great American spirit, and you see these people who are flooded out of their homes and said, we're going to build back and we'll build back even better. No, don't. That you're going to get hit again. And of course, we've actually rewarded this through FEMA and different insurance policies. What we need is people to retreat. Easy to say if you have resources, terrible if you don't, you're displaced. So, but now people are beginning to pay attention to it, and we begin to look at migration, retreat. The state of Maine, actually, when we did the study on sea level rise, we said only one place was worth fortifying, defending, the city of Portland. Everybody else should retreat. So now we're looking at, in the context of US, we're looking at climate migration, we're looking at retreat, we're looking at relocation, we're looking at the most vulnerable, their characteristics and how we can protect them. And of course, there's programs such as buyouts. But what happens to these folks? We still don't know. We really don't know. I don't know if there's any great follow-up on the people who were displaced by the various hurricanes that have hit the Gulf Coast. But now, just recently, the Urban Institute, Urban and Pew Institute are both ones that have paid a lot of attention to this. And they just got a grant from the National Academy of Sciences. It has a special focus in the Gulf area, and to look at what is the capacity of some of the places to receive communities that are moving in, because we've focused not just on the people who are leaving, but what capacity do we have? I mean, supposing, I don't know, Indiana flooded completely. I mean, what capacity does Cleveland have to receive people? What can we do for them? So they're working in conjunction with Texas Southern, University of Central Florida. They're working with RAND, Enterprise Community Partners, probably names that are familiar to you. And they're now actively looking at this. And this is really great. And I think we should be following this. I've sent the link, I think, is in the next slide. Well, not many, but anyway. So the link is here. I'll show it to you. So as we say, we have it here. We have it here in our own country. We had about 43,000 FEMA buyouts in the 1980s, but we also have it in Sandy, post-Sandy, New York and New Jersey. Climate migrants are people who had to move because of the risks, and families who abandon their homes or seek jobs elsewhere. It's just very difficult to estimate. We don't really have any form of continuous registration. And of course, it's all mixed up with personal life choices. It's the thing that pushed them out, but maybe they thought it was time to move anyway and there's better jobs. So it's very hard to measure. And of course, it's difficult. Any of you who do surveys and interviews and more qualitative research know often that when you interview people post an event, they have a sort of a post-event rationalization for what they did. So you don't always get at the core of what But the fact of the matter is we know people are being displaced. Hurricane Michael displaced about 464,000 people, nearly 500,000 people in the south were displaced there. The Woolsey fires have displaced, and the fires in California are continuing to displace. Adjacent states, Idaho, Arizona, are now getting people coming in. The whole housing market there is being pushed up by people coming in. Cities like Phoenix and Tucson and places even like Coeur d'Alene are all experiencing Californians who just say, we give up. You know, we've been burned down twice, or there's been floods or subsidence. Maybe this is not the state we should be in. So just one set of fires displaced 182,000 people. Sometimes it's temporary. Those people will go back. I'm not sure I would, but often it leads to this, what we call long-term resettlement. And we don't know truly what's happening to a lot of these people. Next. So increasingly the question is, where do they go? We often overlook that. You know, we're so focused on what's driving people out, then we forget about where they go. And this is where cities, urban areas need to be particularly paying attention, because they may want to move to areas that have lower unemployment, where housing is affordable, where wages are decent. And we found out, for instance, with California, say they moved into neighborly states. When we had Puerto Rico, a lot of them moved into the Orlando area, which interestingly affected voting in that area. So we have these dynamics going on right now. Next. And if we look at where sea level rise is projected to occur, I think we can see probably a lot more of this is actually going to be occurring up and down both coasts. Next. We could skip this. I think this is just more at risk. So we have an assumption. Most of the models are looking at the impacts of climate change will progress. And it's probably not going to be a smooth arc. We're realizing now that things are actually accelerating more quickly and more on a much bigger scale than we thought. So we may be at some kind of tipping point, but something could flip things completely, which affects the agricultural, economic, and other systems. And it makes it sometimes less predictable. But if we're not paying attention, we're not prepared. So I think this is a question of climate refugees, environmental refugees. It's a global problem. We're going to see more and more of it as climate change affects through drought, floods, sea level rise, etc. But it's also happening on our own doorstep. And we need more work on this. And we need to look at how cities in particular are prepared to accept some of these refugees into our cities. So a lot of work to be done. I've given you the link. That's from the Urban Institute that outlines the grant and the scope of work that they're going to be doing with the University of Central Florida and Texas. So that and the New York link, I hope, will provide some good reference to you. So,
and we can share some of these in our follow-up email. Or yeah, or a follow-up email.
Yeah.
So,
okay, so
yeah, I think this is a good
that one, but there we go.
Yes, or this one.
Oh, this one, whatever one you want. Yeah. So I'm happy to take questions at this point. So do you adjudicate that, Jack? I don't know.
Yeah, and if it's all right, I actually have one to kind of get conversation started on this. Sure. So one of the biggest themes in the kind of environmentalist literature is mitigation versus adaptation, especially for cities and settlements. For somewhere like the Rust Belt, take Cleveland, for example, we're pretty darn safe from natural disasters.
Yes.
And we have a good amount of fresh water right in our back door. But that doesn't free us from having to do some level of, I would warrant, adaptation. How do we sort of start planning to adapt for this group of vulnerable people, either coming from the United States or coming from abroad into our city?
Yeah, it's this is interesting. So there's a sense of what we are personally and collectively responsible for doing just to try and slow down the effects and reduce our emissions, our own footprint, and what we as universities or firms or whatever do. And tell you the truth, I'm not really sure what the state of Ohio is doing. But there is no doubt that we need to prepare for mitigation adaptations. You say we're very safe, second safest city in the United States ironically, Buffalo that gets all the snow is supposed to be number one, I think. But when you think of it, we don't have wildfires encroaching us. We don't have big earthquakes. Tornadoes are more in the south. We're not having major hurricanes, but we will get warmer and wetter. That is to be expected. The great thing we do have is that lake. Water is clearly, and people focus on food, but of course you can't have food if you don't have water. Water is going to be the key dynamic of the whole coming century. Some people will have too much of it by floods and sea level rise, and some people won't have enough of it. And some of us are sitting relatively pretty with this. So Cleveland is sitting well, but of course it does have affordable housing, but you have to have the jobs as well for people to come to. Refugees, immigrants are very good at starting up their own businesses, but they, unless they're going to become a dependent population, you need to have them to have jobs to come to. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean to say it's not that, if you build it, they will come, but there's no doubt that I think people are looking more and more at Cleveland as a good place to be. Certainly if its economy can revitalize.
Yeah. We do have one question in the chat. When refugees enter the United States by the southern border asking for asylum, they get a credible fear interview. Is the climate crisis in their country of origin considered officially for that?
At the moment, I don't think so. It's more on violence, persecution, showing that, your husband was murdered or you've been intimidated, your business was burned down. It'd be interesting now to read this report that just came out this morning to see whether this administration, whether there's a change in tune and whether they're addressing this fact. It's good that it is one of the 4 reports, which means they're actually biting their teeth into the problem. But I don't think at this moment they can mention crop failure and successive crop failures and poverty and fear of starvation, but I don't know. That's a very good question. I'm actually going to make a note of that because that is an excellent question.
And we do have some of our refugees resettlement organizations on the Zoom. And so if any of them have the answer to that, if you want to jump in real quick.
Yeah, they may know a lot more because they actually handle all of this.
I did have a similar question. I kind of wondered whether we have any data from USCIS on claims that are related to climate refugees. So I'm thinking most likely there is none because even the term itself is not well defined. So would that be correct to assume that?
Patrick, it's interesting, even the Afghani refugees that are coming here in other cities, they are not actually classified as refugees at the moment, officially. They have a strange sort of 12-month visa type situation until their status is determined. So even they are not officially called refugees at the moment, even though it would, to us, seem to meet all of that classification.
Right.
Irene raised her hand.
Hi, I'm Irene. Hi, Vicki. Thanks for inviting me to this. My name is Irene Hassan. I'm the Minister for Refugee and Migration Services for the United Church of Christ national setting. And I apologize, I'm going to keep my camera off because I have a cold, and so I'm kind of gross today. I just wanted to follow up to Deirdre's comments about climate change and refugee status, and that no, climate change does not count as a refugee status officially for the United States. The credible threat has to be a direct threat in your life. Even gang warfare or a corrupt government doesn't count as reasons to become a legal refugee in the United States. You have to be able to show that you personally will die if you stay in the country that you're at to get a credible threat claim for asylum or refugee status in the United States. We at the United Church of Christ believe this should be changed, and we're actively advocating for the U.S. government to update its refugee policy to include climate change and climate crisis refugees. But currently it does not. But this is a major point of advocacy that, if that is an interest of yours, that we are actively working on in our organization. Thank you.
There's a great point, Irene. It's such a narrow definition, as you say. Even people who's fleeing life and limb often are not granted the term. So as we say, there's no official, even by agencies like the United Nations High Commission on Refugees does not recognize the term. It's not a term recognized by countries, and it's not a term recognized by any of the agencies, but it is a working term used by a lot of the aid agencies and recognized, at least conceptually, by people.
If there's not another question, I do have one myself, but I want to let our audience ask questions. For one of our refugee services organizations, I see Matando is still on. I apologize if I didn't say that properly. I was speaking to another group, and they said that even as we try to resettle refugees in Cleveland, and of course we would welcome refugees from all over, including internal migrants, how are we handling the housing crisis? I've heard that that's still a problem. Affordable housing is one of the large problems within the city, within transportation, with the bus lines. How is that being handled?
Well, I think, I don't know if the aid agencies have a thought on that. It's certainly something that we in Urban could be doing a lot of work on. You know, sometimes when you have a refugee situation, there's an obvious housing solution. In the state of Maine, where I worked for 17 years, the town of Lewiston, which was a Franco, the poor Quebecois had come off the farms. So interestingly, migrants, they come in to work in the textile factories. When those textile factories, when the textiles went south, quite literally into North Carolina, they had these large 3-4 story apartments left, and where the mill workers used to work, and there was nobody there. And they were wondering whether to tear them down. The town of Lewiston's population had gone down. And when we had the Somali refugees, the Catholic Charities, one of the other settlement agencies, a big one in Maine, decided that Lewiston was the place to go because there was housing. I mean, this was not in terrible shape. It was actually decent enough apartments. And so that became the locus of the Somali population, which interestingly has totally revitalized the town.
Yeah.
The schools, the soccer teams, the food's got a lot more interesting. And they found jobs and started businesses. But Lewiston was chosen in large measure because it had this swath of vacant, usable housing.
Yeah.
Right.
So
and we, some work that a student of mine, Cameron Caputi, did, he found that, for instance, in the Detroit area, when refugees came, they were sort of put in area, but the housing was so bad and there was so much violence, they thought, this isn't much better than where we left, and they moved out as fast as they could.
Yeah.
So, you mean, why would we expect refugees to put up with something we're not prepared to put up with ourselves? So a lot of thought has to go into appropriate housing. There's no doubt.
Yeah. Matando
has his hand up. Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just going to answer the question about how we're handling housing crisis. Actually, I'll say in a sense we're struggling because essentially we have, for example, some of the Afghan parolees coming in. We have to put them in maybe hotels for a while we find houses, and there is not essentially no homes available. We have to consider putting families in outside of Cleveland, so maybe looking at Palmer, Strongville, and those are not regions that necessarily have, I would say, good public transportation. Cleveland in would be the best way because there's public transportation, there's halal food stores, and essentially a growing community of people that they can relate to. So the housing crisis is affecting us tremendously, and we're reaching out to as many individuals as we can to support. We had to put a family in Airbnbs. So it's
a big one.
It's a very big one that is not being as we would like it to be, but unfortunately.
For whom do you work?
I'm with USCRI.
Okay.
So we have just 2 minutes left, and Deirdre, we cannot thank you enough for your wealth of knowledge and amazing slide deck that really encapsulates the meaning of what you're trying to share with us. Grace is going to wrap it up. And as Deirdre mentioned, we are here for you. We want to help you with solutions. The Irvin School clearly has experts in that area, so we want to be here for you. Grace.
I want to thank Jack for your wonderful moderation and also everybody with the great questions. And Deirdre, you brought up the critical issues, especially with the most vulnerable population for refugees and migrants. And we appreciate you bring this to our awareness. And important reminder for next month, we have a November brown bag. It's in on November 18, and I posted on the chat area. In this session, we are going to present a short documentary looking at the micro level of Cleveland area using a documentary that our film professor, Cheatham Slankard, she presented. And her documentary will capture and provide a glimpse into the Cleveland refugee life. And also afterwards, we'll discuss the community transportation transformation in that area. And on behalf of CRIS team, I want to thank you for coming, and we look forward to seeing you in the next brown bag session. And we also will follow with an online survey, and we'll send it to all of you. So we're looking forward to your feedback. And if you have more questions, please feel free to stay, and we'll be here.